From Dragon 360, this is Digital Banter, a podcast focused on modern marketing tactics and driving real business results. And now, here are your hosts.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back for another episode of Digital Banter. James, Super Bowl's coming up on Sunday. I know you're a bandwagon or Chiefs fan. Are you ready?
Now we're diehards in this house, man. Diehards. I gotta tell the story on this one. So he calls me a bandwagon. So Jets are my team. I'm from New York. Anybody who follows anything in sports knows that the Jets are horrendous. I think they have the longest drought of making a playoff, let alone a Super Bowl. So a couple years ago, 3 years today, actually, because today is my daughter's birthday, we said, if my daughter is born on the Super Bowl, we are going to change the team that we like. When I say we, I mean my wife is a Patriots fan, to whoever won the Super Bowl. So she wasn't actually born on the Super Bowl. I think she was born the day before the Super Bowl. Either way, it was close enough for me to become a diehard Chiefs fan. Her first onesie was a Patrick is Mahomes onesie. It was awesome. We still have it. All of the napkins in our house from their last Super Bowl are still in the drawer. All the plates are ready to go. So we're prepped and ready to go. And it's going to get crazy. Way crazier than the Eagles when they lose. I can only imagine what's going to happen when they lose. What do you think is going to happen? You think you guys are going to tip and burn cars, or what do you think is going to happen in Philly after that?
Oh, every bus station roof will be crashed into, not just one, and all poles will have people on them not celebrating. So, yes, it will go up in flames. Not celebrating, but rather throwing Molotov cocktails and everything else. Look, we're diehards. We don't mess around. Go Birds. But I think you bring up an interesting point here about the Jets. The metrics kind of aren't in their favor as far as wins and losses since the 1960s. So That's a good segue into our topic today: real metrics that people should be using to measure their demand gen efforts. And this topic is kind of born out of the added pressure that is being placed on marketing and sales this year, especially more than any other, around delivering bottom line results, having greater accountability around opportunities, pipeline, and revenue, which can minimize testing. It can minimize kind of exploration of ways to energize the brand for long-term growth. But in our experience, the struggle is that many marketers kind of need to figure out and have a challenge in figuring out what metrics to show execs that are directional, leading indicators towards those bottom line results of ops, pipeline, and revenue. That's a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of weeks, kind of consulting and driving forward, how we look at the bigger picture rather than just the bottom of the results. And James, do you want to speak a little bit more about that? You're kind of on the front lines.
Yeah, the focus on efficiency is real, which is great. There's nothing wrong with focusing on efficiency. I think the thing that's really tough is everybody in the space is talking about, everything comes down to, we do a lot of paid media, return on ad spend. What is our return on investment? How high can we get that? The better the return on investment, technically, the more efficient you are. The problem is that we're not e-com. We can't make a change today and know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that a lot of people are struggling with that because, the industry is so focused on CAC to LTV ratio, pipeline, revenue, all great metrics that we should all be striving for. But what you do today doesn't affect those metrics tomorrow in the same way as it does with something with a shorter sales cycle. And like I said, it's great that we're focused on those things. I think the industry might be taking things a little bit too far at this point.
Yeah. And kind of industry pundits aside, I think it's easy to throw onto an executive dashboard or slide deck. It's easy to say we got X amount of leads or MQLs or SQLs from these channels, but all marketers know, and really the executives should know, that data lies at the end of the day. It's only indicative of certain elements and whatever you're putting into it, but it only tells part of the story.
A great example, like customer acquisition costs. So it's the cost to acquire a customer, and how every company measures that is different. You know, is it total marketing spend? Is it total media spend? Do you take into consideration the salary of every single member on your team? And it's funny because I feel like the people, you know, we're talking to marketing leaders making 150, 200, a significant amount of money, right? And, you know, we're arguing over little bits of ad spend where there's fluff on the team. I mean, we're seeing a bunch of layoffs right now. I think people are starting to realize that, but there's no consistency in those metrics, and you need to have them be all inclusive to understand what ROI actually is. Like, ROI is not return on ad spend. I mean, if we want to keep pushing towards revenue, that's only good at the end of the day, when profitability should be looked at as kind of the key factor.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a point before that's valid to revisit, is around, you know, other business types. E-commerce as a great example there. You know, many of the proposed ways of getting insight into the directional data that is indicative of whether you're being successful or not are things like, you know, the how did you hear about us required field on a form. Well, that's great if that's the business model and the way in which you're attracting business. But what about e-commerce businesses? What about those brands that are heavily influenced by calls? And yes, kind of just to go off on a tangent here a little bit, there's the other aspect of things of having the conversations with customers. How did you hear about us? Where did you learn about us? Things like that. And us, you know, it's a valid data point, but we're told by others in the industry, no, you don't want to do that because the human element creates bias, right? I think the bigger picture here, though, is those are just a microcosm, a very small segment of what we can be measuring to really help us understand what is working within our strategy and whether just overall it's working or not. Because at the end of the day, executives don't care whether it's a demand gen strategy, a lead gen strategy, or any gen strategy that you're embarking on. They just care about the results at the bottom line and whether it's driving the business forward. It's our job as marketers to craft those metrics and showcase whether or not we're on the path to being successful or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it really comes down, like, I think now we should kind of transition to what should we be measuring. There's really 2 or 3 things that we're looking for. Are we reaching the right people? Do they like what we have to say? And is it convincing them to buy our stuff? It's very basic, but those are the 3 things that we need to be looking for leading indicators on. So some of the things that we can do. So first thing, are we targeting the right people? Yes, we can plug in our targeting to many different tools. And I feel like you can have a very solid understanding based on your targeting on whether or not they're the right people. But I mean, we talked the other day about all of like the bot traffic coming through and all of this, all of that. And I think finding out what happens after that, this is where I think lead gen still has a play. So being able to see the contacts that are coming through for demos, trials, whatever, making sure that they do fit your ideal customer profile. It doesn't necessarily have to be lead gen at this point. I mean, we're using tools like Clearbit, Lead Feeder. This all started with this, with an Australian company. What was that company, Andy? Lead Forensics.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So it's spread out, and it seems like everybody's doing it now, but there essentially allows you to go in and see the companies that are visiting your website based on really their IP addresses. So again, are the companies that are visiting your website more tailored, or do they fit your ICP? I mean, that's been a huge thing for us since we've really started to push our positioning as an agency more to B2B, and we've seen that positive shift of visitors to our website going from, you know, our vertical agnostic past to much more B2B focused companies. And that's like a great indicator that what we're doing is working. That's not necessarily lead gen focused. So there's a lot that you can do to say, like, who are you targeting the right people? Then the next piece is, do they like our stuff? Do they like our stuff is really engagement metrics. I mean, the basic Click-through rate is one that's been around forever. It's not going away. Social engagement is now a huge thing as the industry is moving away from gated content, the whole lead gen thing, to demand gen. And now it's more about like, do people like our stuff? Is it entertaining, engaging, educating? And you can really see that on the engagement side. So those are kind of the two things I start. And then like, are you influencing them to purchase? That's another thing. And that's really where you're going to be able to see that in the, how did you hear about us? Like some of those more soft touch channels. I mean, that it's really about the quality of the bottom of the funnel hand raisers at the end of the day. Cause that's the thing, like B2B is doing a lot of great things right now with like influencer marketing. You're starting to see take off. You're seeing a lot more like comedy being brought into advertising. And then I think the big thing, the question is yes, do they like our stuff? Yes, is it the right people? But like, is our product resonating with them is the next piece. And that's where the funnel is changing a bit. We've talked about full funnel being dead, and now it's like more about the ability to, I say, like educate, entertain, and then convert.
I want to jump into each of those sections a little bit more deliberately and give our listeners some concrete kind of metrics to think about. But before we do that, let's also set the stage around some variables from a strategic perspective, because while the metrics that we'll talk about can kind of be strategy agnostic, there are some parameters and variables that come into play in how you measure them and what you're looking at. For example, are you promoting the brand? Or are you promoting products? Or are you a solution-based company and you're pushing that? Obviously, demand gen versus ABM is a variable there, especially when you look at it from the perspective of ICPs versus accounts, right? And whether you're running any holdout tests from an ad perspective, in the sense of exposures and whether or not people are actually moving through the process. And then ultimately the goals and objectives around the strategy itself: awareness, market expansion, penetration, share growth, et cetera. All of those influence and impact kind of how you are going to go about measuring certain things, but the metrics themselves kind of don't change. So I want to dive into, let's say, quality of reach as one of those buckets and subsets that you talked about, James. So you talked about, on the paid side of things, having more control over it. And I think that's a great kind of segue into looking at the demographic reporting in whatever ad platforms you're running on, especially if it's paid social, the companies, the demographics, job titles, personas, et cetera. But then on the flip side of that, looking at it from the perspective of the organic reach. The same data exists. It might not be at full transparency as the paid side, but it still exists. And it's kind of a leading indicator before you even get to the site traffic of whether you're even reaching the right people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing about LinkedIn specifically. Unfortunately, you don't get that level of insights from Facebook, TikTok, whatever other channels you may be on. But in LinkedIn, you can see what companies are seeing our ads, what companies are engaging with our content. You can see somebody's commenting like who they are. I can't tell you how many campaigns we run where even like all of the comments on the ads are like spam that we have to filter out. Like some random person saying, "Nice, this is cool." You can tell whether or not it's real or not based on what they say. You should be looking at that stuff. It's so interesting. I feel like a piece that, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but a piece that like we always miss is like the separation from paid social and organic social, of who's responding to the comments, who's like managing it from a community management perspective. A lot of companies like won't even respond or message to any comments on their ads, where reaching out via chat on LinkedIn or direct messages, like that's a huge way that people are doing business now. Especially, I mean, in the D2C space, you see it even more with like Instagram, but that engagement is huge. And being able to manually go through and look at the people and companies and making sure that they're the right people. It's the first place I would start.
Well, to that end, many brands get fixated on the company page when in reality, the company page has the least amount of reach and potential reach compared to the individuals. They forget, or they don't think about that side of the coin as far as the data of reach. And really, when you pull together those stakeholders, whether it's the evangelist of the brand or the stakeholders that are trying to be part of those communities, pulling together those insights around, hey, these are the companies, these are individuals, and these are the roles that are viewing my posts. When you aggregate that, you can get a better picture of the total kind of impact that you can be having towards that directional perspective, which then leads into the site traffic.
Yeah. And then like that's why I said use those tools before and make sure that the right companies are coming through your website. I think another thing that I missed before, those tools also will tell you the traffic source. So they'll tell you who's coming in through your paid search campaigns, who's coming in through your paid social campaigns. Like you can see the source medium for those IP addresses and make sure that they're the right people.
Right. And with Clearbit itself, so we use Clearbit on our site, and we're using just the free trial version. Yes, it's only parsing out and providing so much information, but our site traffic isn't high enough to really warrant the need to start paying for it. A higher traffic brand, obviously that justifies probably the expenditure about that. But think about the data, not just as far as directional usage and data is concerned regarding who's visiting from an ICP perspective, but think about the directional data decision-making it provides as far as, you know, if these people are visiting our site, well, how are they visiting? Number one, are they coming in through search, therefore signaling an intent? Or whatever traffic source it may be, you know, there's an inherent opportunity there to pass that data along to sales or keep it within the marketing sphere of things and start to create account-based marketing campaigns that are nurturing, that are creating awareness, that are trying to nurture those folks into the demos, the meetings, make them into hand raisers. It's really that blend of demand gen into ABM then that can lead to a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the scale of your campaigns too, you can get super granular. I mean, we run stuff at pretty small scale, but like our search campaigns, we can be like, oh, what did they search for? What was the keyword that they came in on? Like, and understand exactly what they were looking for. I mean, in our situation, I think it's a little bit different because we have 2 paid media guys working on the sales stuff, but you know, to be able to create the ability to do that at scale, that would be amazing.
And then when you move past the qualitative data around companies, that's when you can start to look at quantitative data as far as the impact and the halo effect of your efforts. Are you seeing a lift in key page views, especially if you are product centric, right? If you are looking at the aggregated lift in page views, you're creating product awareness. In theory, you're going to have an increase in page views around that product, whether that's product searches on the front end, paid and organic, but also on the back end of things when people are coming to the site. You should see an incremental lift. And that's where we need to start thinking about those directional data metrics that will ultimately lead us into the CAC, the revenue, and things like that. And then also lead us into the fact of what is the lift in conversions, the steps right before a demo, an op, a pipeline kind of opportunity, et cetera. So do you want to talk about kind of quality of conversions and lift in conversions, James?
Yeah, I actually wanted to jump into one thing before that. Lift in branded search, I feel like, is a huge underutilized metric. It's very difficult to run brand campaigns. People run brand lift surveys where you send a question to somebody, which of these brands have you heard of? Which of these brands do you prefer? And honestly, like, you need to be a big brand in order for that to have any impact whatsoever. And even that, like, I don't know how much I believe that stuff. Versus, you know, in your paid search campaigns, you can see how many searches are for your brand or your products every single month. You can do it on the organic side too. That data is not quite as clean as it would be on the paid side. But if you can see, especially for startups, if you see increases in search volume around your brand, I mean, that's a huge indicator that people are talking about you, your stuff's getting shared other places, like the stuff that you're doing is working. So that's like, again, people struggle to measure brand, so I really wanted to call that one out. On the conversion side, there's a lot of different things that you can measure. Pages per visit, those key page views. Again, that's really about like, what are people going to your website to do? Pricing pages would be another one. We call them conversion. Like, I always joke with our team that we don't use the word conversion because you need to explicitly say what you're talking about, because a conversion could be a demo request, a sales call request, all the way up to like somebody who was on the site for 5 minutes and viewed 3 pages. It's important for us to like track and see those things because you have everything from a conversion that's a leading indicator to a conversion that is a business opportunity with potential revenue associated with it. And that's where us as marketers, like, we can build retargeting lists based off of all that stuff and try to move people along the customer journey. I think that's where it does become important to track some of those additional elements. We have this focus on like cost per lead, cost per lead, cost per lead. That's not that important. Like, we want somebody to go to our website and engage with our content. And I feel like reporting on that stuff isn't always the greatest thing for executives. And that's why, like, we don't do it that much. But if we're sending high quality people who fit our ICP, people who fit our target personas, and they're spending 10 minutes on our website and looking at our pricing page, our contact page, and read 4 blog posts, like, those are awesome intent signals that somebody is interested in what we have to offer. They might not be ready to buy right now because they might not have budget. They might have a timeline of 6 months. They might, like, all of those other elements that get in the way. Doesn't mean that it's not a quality person, doesn't mean that your ads aren't working just because they didn't drive a demo request, right?
Exactly. And to that end, it's the quantitative side and the qualitative side again. Quantitatively, are we seeing a lift in our key engagements? Form submits being one of them, but also video views, gated content downloads, and those other key metrics that are indicative of somebody researching, consuming information, and just on the cusp of being a hand raiser. But when they become a hand raiser, what's the quality of the form submit as it relates to the ICP? And if you're running ABM campaigns, are those the companies that you're actively targeting? Because that's a great indicator of whether ad exposure of any kind via marketing is having an impact and a trickle-down effect on whether somebody's moving into a pipeline or an opportunity or an SQL if you're moving backwards. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's quality over quantity at the end of the day, not just, to your point, a heavy focus on cost per lead, bottom dollar wins, because bottom dollar doesn't win if you're driving all kinds of crap leads.
It's the combination of all of those key leading indicators that lead to all of the bottom of the funnel metrics that people are looking to see. Revenue, CAC to LTV ratio, like, those are things that you measure over long periods of time. Like, demo to demo close rate, like, there's definitely bottom of the funnel stuff that you can report on, but again, you're focused on capturing demand at that point, to use the phrase that everybody uses.
But even building off of that, there's only so much you can control. As a marketer, you only control so much of the journey. And really, sales, on the flip side of that, can only control so much of their journey. It's a buyer journey. That's what it's called for a reason. It's a buyer journey because it's buyer led.
Yeah. I don't want to get into the point of blaming sales either, because I actually saw a great post on this today, being more of like a leadership issue on some of those things. Like, oh, we drive all these leads, and sales, the whole marketing and sales thing, we drive all these leads, sales doesn't reach out, it's not going into the system properly. Some of the situations that we've run into, I can definitely say, are not sales' fault. They're like leadership's fault for not having the appropriate system in place.
Exactly. And that was not my intent. My intent was more so saying that the brand side only controls what they can control as far as the buyer journey is concerned, because the buyer is the one that is dictating how they're going to buy, when they're going to buy, and when and where they're going to buy from. The other thing that I want to kind of circle back to is we talked about metrics that are, more or less coming out of Google Analytics in some cases, or HubSpot, Marketo, the other kind of CRM databases that might be at a brand's disposal. The word of caution I want to throw out there is avoid being too generic in the metrics that you're looking at. We talked about lift and key page views. What I would shy away from is any changes or metrics related to time on site or bounce rate, sticky engagement metrics like that, because they can be easily skewed. You have one person on there for 10 minutes and another person on for 5 or a lot less. And those numbers are not something that I would put weight behind and showcase to an executive. I'm looking at the long-term trend. I'm looking for the impacts, to your point, James, before, the impacts on branded search, product name searches. And then on the flip side of that, what are they doing on the site? Those lift and key page views, who's visiting the site, and then ultimately leading into conversions, key engagements. And that's when you are able to then say pipeline, CAC, opportunities, right? Rev. And in that entire broad picture, you have a dashboard or some level of idea and leading indicators around, hey, we're seeing these lifts on the front end. Well, the back end, if our sales cycle is 6 months long, obviously that's a factor, but we're going to see a lift in the back end of things because we have these leading indicators up front.
Yeah. Key page views is probably the one that I would focus on the most. Like you said, bounce rate, time on site. Honestly, like they're not even remotely accurate in Google Analytics half the time. But if somebody's visiting your pricing page, your case studies, your high value piece of content, I think that those are still great things to measure. Like we talked about using those tools before of like the IP addresses that visiting website, you can see who those people are. Like you can see that, you know, this big brand that fits our ICP perfectly visited our site, saw 3 of our case studies and our pricing page. We actually can look at that information in real time, hand that off to sales and be like, hey, that would be a good time to call these people. They're actively looking at it.
Exactly.
And it's like, that's what ABM should be, not, I think, what a lot of people make it be. It's a whole other episode.
The last point I want to make on this before we kind of close out today's episode is the only way these directional incremental lift metrics are going to be successful for you is if you know where you're coming from, because you can't tell where you're going to until you know where you're coming from. So benchmarks are one of the most important foundational items that you need to have in place, especially when we're talking about things like branded search traffic or key page view lifts. You have to know where your kind of consistent average is, because then as you move forward and you have these, you know, higher ticket, bigger strategic initiatives underway, you'll be able to effectively know whether or not you're truly getting lift, or if it's kind of a baseline and a decline, or just a flat trend.
And that's why there's no such thing as industry averages either. So when you start reporting on these metrics and leadership asks for, hey, what's the industry average on our key page views? That's kind of a terrible example here, but probably something that I would have heard before. Like, that doesn't exist. What exists is the benchmark that you have now, and the goal of whatever the activity is to improve on those existing benchmarks that are specific to you.
Well said. Any other closing thoughts, James?
That's it.
Okay. Well, hopefully our listeners today got a little bit more insight, some ideas around real metrics that they can use to measure the effectiveness of their marketing campaigns and strategies outside of just rev, pipeline, and ops. But if anybody has any questions, always feel free to reach out to James and I on social. Like, subscribe, connect with us on social, and catch you next time.
Now do the
Go Birds.
Thanks for listening to Digital Banter. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.